A priceless violin disappears mid-performance with a trace. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host Alexander. Let me know where you're listening in. Me love seeing this community connect. Your comments always brighten my day. Let's begin. The summer sun cast a golden light upon the village green of Nether Barrow, warming the old brick of ivy-covered cottages and glinting off the silver spoons resting in bone china saucers. It was the sort of day that even the most pessimistic villager had to admit was really quite nice, and the annual garden fete, hosted by the Honourable Mrs. Cecily Mayhew at Gossington Hall, was in full swing. There were the usual attractions, a sponge cake competition, a white elephant stall with slightly chipped porcelain, a brass band that valiantly played through occasional off-key trumpet notes, and young girls from the parish dancing in white frocks with blue sashes. The vicar, Reverend Chislehurst, sweated gently in his collar as he judged the floral arrangements. Everyone had turned out to be everyone, at least, and the air was thick with the scent of lavender, roses, and thinly disguised competition. Miss Jane Marple, sitting beneath a neatly trimmed yew tree with a modest plate of cucumber sandwiches, sipped her tea and listened. She always listened to Mrs. Penelope Hargraves boasting of her son's promotion in the Foreign Office, to Colonel Brackett muttering about a damned shoddy batch of geraniums this year, and to the distant, haunting strains of a violin echoing faintly from the conservatory. "Funny thing," remarked Mrs. Bantry, lowering her voice as she leaned toward Miss Marple, the violinist. Cecily said she'd hired a proper concert player. "You know, a Mr. Leo Stone came highly recommended, bit of a recluse, but a genius, apparently, only he hasn't come out once to play for the guests." Miss Marple nodded politely, her pale blue eyes following the sound of the violin. It was beautiful, haunting, deliberate, almost melancholy, but it was odd. That sort of playing should have drawn a crowd, yet few had ventured toward the source. A commotion near the tea tent distracted her, voices raised, a crash. And then Mrs. Mayhew herself, usually the very image of restrained elegance, burst through the crowd with her lace-gloved hand clasped tightly over her mouth. "He's just gone," she gasped. "Mr. Stone. He's gone, and the violino, dear Lord. There's blood." The words fell like a thunderclap over the fete. Silence followed, thick, disbelieving silence. Miss Marple set her teacup down with great care. All around her, villagers froze mid-bite, midship, mid-laughter. Gone. Blood. For a moment, no one moved. Then the crowd surged like a wave, heading toward the conservatory. Miss Marple did not rush. She stood slowly, brushing a crumb from her skirt, and made her way through the crowd with the quiet patience of someone who knew that the important things were never found in the first moments of a spectacle, but in the ones just before. The conservatory door had been flung open. The music had stopped. Inside, a bow lay discarded on the floor near a smear of dark red across the tiles. An empty violin case was propped beside a Tipperjuva music stand. No sign of Leo Stone. No sign of struggle. Only a single chair, vacant. It was not what was present that disturbed Miss Marple most, but what was missing. The mood in Nether Barrow shifted as quickly and sharply as the summer breeze that swept through the fete, fluttering linen napkins and stirring the petals on the prize-winning dahlias. Word of Mr. Leo Stone's disappearance and the ominous smear of blood in the conservatory spread through the gathering like a brushfire. Teacups were abandoned midship, cakes forgotten on paper plates, children were herded back to their mothers, and old Colonel Brackett was seen pressing a folded handkerchief against his temple, muttering that this was just the sort of chaos one could expect once the arts were involved. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had quietly removed herself from the crowd clustering near the conservatory. She strolled around the side of Gossington Hall, her eyes lifting briefly to the ivy-covered windows above, as if committing the scene to memory. To the casual observer, she was simply an elderly lady taking her time, but her mind ticked away beneath that serene exterior, sifting impressions, movements, and fragments of conversation. Back on the lawn, Inspector Dermot from Milchester had arrived with a single constable in tow. He was a square-jawed man in his early 40s with a no-nonsense air and the slight weariness of someone used to dealing with overactive imaginations. "Now then, ladies and gentlemen," he said, raising his voice to command attention, "we'll need everyone to remain calm and stay here while we conduct a preliminary search. This is not the time for speculation or dramatic conclusions. A man may be missing, yes, but that does not mean foul play is confirmed." He shot a meaningful look at Mrs. Mayhew, who had taken to a chaise long with a lavender-scented hanky pressed delicately to her temple. "But the blood, Inspector," she murmured, "and his violin, such a beautiful instrument, vanished without a trace. Could be an accident," Dermot offered brusquely. "A slip, a fall, no reason to leap to murder." The crowd grumbled. Several heads turned toward one another, eyebrows raised. Nether Barrow was a village well versed in drama of the domestic sort. Scalding affairs, vicious church politics, and the odd case of sheep theft, but nothing like this. A man had played haunting music behind glass walls, and now he was simply gone. Miss Marple returned just as the inspector was attempting to disperse the growing cluster of gossipers near the croquet. She caught the end of a rather breathless theory from Mrs. Hargraves, who insisted that a rival musician had likely staged an elaborate kidnapping. "Nonsense," scoffed Mr. Ellis, the village solicitor, tugging at his waistcoat. "The man probably wandered off for a smoke or a sulk. Artists are temperamental sorts." "Tempered enough to leave blood behind?" asked Miss Hartley, the schoolmistress, her pinched face pale with intrigue. Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes gently scanning the guests. It was always fascinating, she thought, how quickly ordinary people shifted under pressure. The patterns revealed themselves. Some defended the missing man with fierce loyalty. Others condemned him as untrustworthy before facts were known. Some leaned into fear, others sought logic. Even when it didn't fit, a sudden gust caught the edge of the tent, flapping it noisily. Mrs. Bantry, ever alert to the latest development, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, did you hear? They found the back door of the conservatory open. Not forced, mind you, just wide open." "Is that so?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "And where does it lead?" "Onto the east path, the one that runs behind the rose hedge, past the little orchard. You know the one. You can hardly see it from the house." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "Yes, I remember." Within the hour, Inspector Dermot had organised a loose search of the grounds, the constable sweeping the perimeter of the estate with a few willing volunteers. There was talk of sending for dogs. Though the warm sun and trampled fate grounds had surely destroyed any useful trail. By mid-afternoon, it became clear that Mr. Leo Stone was well and truly gone. Mrs. Mayhew, who insisted on being treated as both hostess and minor victim, had withdrawn to her private sitting room and summoned a doctor for her nerves. Her maid, Daphne, was inconsolable, sobbing into her apron and declaring that Mr. Stone was the gentlest soul alive and would never harm a fly. According to her, the violinist had kept mostly to himself, practicing constantly, declining most social interaction beyond formal greetings. The village, however, had already divided itself into camps. Some believed Leo Stone had been attacked, perhaps even murdered. Others were sure he'd staged his own disappearance in some form of artistic protest or performance, and still others murmured more colourful suspicions. "You mark my words," said Mrs. Webb, who ran the post office and had declared herself an expert in missing persons. "He wasn't who he said he was. Those London musicians, always hiding something. Wouldn't surprise me if he had enemies in Parliament or a secret wife." added a young woman mischievously. Miss Marple sat with a group of matrons beneath the shade of a sycamore, listening. She did not offer theories of her own, but now and again she would ask a question gently, always gently. Did anyone see him arrive today? No. Oh, I suppose he must have come early. Did he keep his violin in the conservatory during rehearsals, or did he carry it with him? Oh, it was there all morning. That's curious, isn't it? The others didn't think so. But Miss Marple did. Later that afternoon, the fete officially disbanded. The cake stands were packed away, the bunting rolled up, the brass band, shaken and silent, left with their instruments tucked under arms. By 5 o'clock, only a few villagers lingered at Gossington Hall, whispering in corners, eyes flicking toward the grand conservatory with a mix of awe and fear. Inspector Dermot had sealed the area off, and his constable stood guard, looking uncomfortable in the heat. Mrs. Mayhew had retreated behind closed doors, leaving her housekeeper to direct the remaining staff, Miss Marple, walking home through the village. Past the war memorial and paused, as she always did. Her steps were slow, but her thoughts were brisk. She had seen a great deal in her life, and while the young men in uniform had chased adventure, she had spent her years in armchairs and vicarage parlours, learning how people revealed themselves in small ways, in idle talk and unconscious gestures. The violin had vanished, the musician had vanished, there was blood but no body. The police looked for footprints, motives, and broken locks. But Miss Marple knew that answers often lived in the things people chose not to say in quiet. Habits. In the stories told after the initial excitement had passed, she reached her cottage on Old Oak Lane, just as the shadows stretched long across the fields. The rose bushes in her front garden were blooming beautifully. She picked off a few withered petals, then turned to her gate where a figure was waiting. It was Constable Rowntree, breathless from his bicycle, his helmet askew. "Miss Marple," he said, eyes wide. "They've found something in the orchard." She didn't ask what, not yet. She simply adjusted her gloves, nodded calmly, and said, "Then, we'd best go and see, wouldn't we?" The orchard behind Gossington Hall had once been a pride of the estate, but in recent years it had gone to a kind of romantic disrepair. The apple trees, thick with twisted limbs, cast long, finger-like shadows over the grass. A soft mist had begun to drift in as the evening cooled, giving the whole place a hushed, almost reverent feel. Beneath the boughs, wildflowers tangled themselves among fallen fruit, and here and there the buzzing of late bees hummed like an undertone to the deepening mystery. Miss Marple arrived with Constable Rowntree at her side, her cane clicking softly against the stone path. They were met by Inspector Dermot, who stood with folded arms near the low wooden fence that separated the orchard from the east path. His expression, usually brisk, now showed the first signs of concern. "It's over this way," he said quietly. Found by young Will Tavish was helping collect bunting and saw something glinting near the hedger. Ow! He led them to the spot, and there, half hidden among the overgrown grass and wind-fallen pears, lay a silver cufflink. It gleamed faintly, the polished surface dulled only slightly by the dirt. Beside it, perhaps a foot away, was a crumpled linen handkerchief with a monogram embroidered in dark blue thread Ellesmere stones. Miss Marple asked, crouching carefully. Dermot nodded. Mrs. Mayhew confirmed it. He wore them when he performed. Said they were a gift from his late uncle. And the handkerchief, she wasn't sure, but given the initials, it's likely his. Miss Marple straightened up slowly, brushing a strand of hair back beneath her hat. "No sign of struggle, I presume?" "None. No drag marks, no blood, no footprints worth noting rounds to dry." He paused. "There's more." He turned and pointed farther into the orchard, to a clearing near a moss-covered stone bench. There, laid with unsettling precision, was the violin case. It was closed. The brass latches fastened tightly, but the leather was scuffed as though it had been dragged or dropped. The label on the side still bore a faded sticker from a music hall in Vienna. Miss Marple bent to inspect it. "I take it the instrument is no longer inside?" she asked. Dermot gave a grim nod. "Empty." There was a strange quiet in the orchard, as though the trees themselves were listening. Miss Marple opened the case gently. A faint scent of resin and old wood rose up, but the velvet lining was undisturbed. The moulded shape of the violin outlined clearly. No splinters, no sign of force. Someone removed it carefully. She said more to herself than to the others. Rowntree shuffled beside her. "But why leave the case?" "A very good question," Miss Marple replied. "And one I suspect our thief, or perhaps our murderer, thought no one would ask." They stood in silence for a moment. The last of the day's light filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows on the grass. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked twice, sharply, then fell silent. Dermot cleared his throat. "I'll have the case dusted, though I doubt we'll find much, and I've sent for a more thorough search team from Milchester. They'll comb the rest of the grounds tonight." Miss Marple nodded. "I expect that will be very useful, but if I may offer a small observation, Inspector, please. It seems rather odd, does it not, that someone would go to the trouble of removing the violin, which I imagine was of great value, but leave behind a monogrammed handkerchief and a cufflink? Almost as though they wanted us to know who had been." Here Dermot raised an eyebrow. "You think it was staged?" "I think," said Miss Marple gently, "that human beings are not as clever as they imagine. They often leave behind too much when trying to leave behind nothing at all. That night, the village of Nether Barrow slept poorly. Gossington Hall remained under observation, with officers stationed at the gates and the conservatory sealed to all but investigators. The fete grounds were deserted, bunting left half-hung, streamers snapping in the breeze. Even the birds seemed to hold back their morning chorus. As if sensing the unease that settled over the village like mist, Miss Marple, however, awoke early, as she always did, and made her tea with a steadiness that seemed to defy the tension in the air. She laid out a soft-boiled egg, her morning paper, and a small notebook, in which she had begun to write a few idle thoughts. Names, mostly: Cecily Mayhew, Leo Stone, Daphne the maid, Inspector Dermot, Mrs. Bountry, Mrs. Hargraves, Colonel Brackett, and one name she circled more than once was Geoffrey Mayhew, the Honourable Mrs. Mayhew's son, who had returned from his overseas commission only a week prior. The inspector had not spoken to him yet, or at least not seriously. But Miss Marple had noted the young man's behaviour at the fete aloof, restless, and watching the conservatory far more than was warranted for someone disinterested in music. Later that morning, the village stirred slowly into life. At the post office, customers pretended to post letters they had already written, hoping to overhear the latest update. At the Green Man pub, whispers turned to speculation, and speculation to rumour. Some claimed the violin had been found sold at a pawn shop in London. Others said Leo Stone had faked the whole thing to escape creditors or a secret scandal. At Gossington Hall, Inspector Dermot began his official questioning. Mrs. Mayhew, once revived by her physician and 3 cups of very strong Darjeeling, sat pale and pinched in her drawing-room as she recounted the day's events with theatrical flair. "Ye played so beautifully," she said, fluttering a hand toward her temple, like a soul in torment. "You heard it, Inspector, didn't you? The way the note seemed to weep, and then gone, just gone. And Mr. Stone, did he have visitors during the week?" Dermot asked. "None I'm aware of. He preferred to keep to himself. Said he needed solitude to prepare. I respected that. Artists are so delicate. And you're sure no one entered the conservatory before the music stopped?" Mrs. Mayhew blinked. "Well, I cannot say for certain. People were coming and going. but no one would dare interrupt him. Daphne, when questioned, said she'd brought Mr. Stone tea twice and a plate of biscuits. He was polite, but odd, she said, wouldn't meet your eye for long, kept humming to himself. Did he ever mention being frightened or troubled? She shook her head, though her lower lip trembled. No, sir, but he did keep the doors locked, said the violin was valuable. More valuable than people knew. Did he ever show it to you? Her eyes dropped. Only once. It was beautiful, gold scrollwork. It looked ancient, outside. Miss Marple stood near the hedgerow at the edge of the orchard, her gaze lingering on the space where the cufflink had been found. She had seen such disappearances before, not of musicians and violins necessarily, but of people who had entangled themselves in other people's lives until their secrets began to fray at the edges. She looked toward the hall, where a tall figure stood in one of the upper windows, half-shadowed. Geoffrey Mayhew, watching the orchard. Miss Marple did not wave, she simply observed, quietly. As always, there was something she needed to remember, something tugging at the edge of her memory. A story from years ago, from a parish in Sussex, a young violinist, a scandal, a lie told too often to hold. She made a small note in her book and underlined one-word: motive. Because what had happened was more than disappearance, more than theft. It was, she suspected, an unravelling, and the village, for all its charm and sunlight, held more than one secret ready to burst into the light. By the time the sun had risen on the third day following the fete, the village of Nether had passed from initial alarm into a sort of theatrical intrigue. Suspicion, like a fine mist, drifted through parlour windows and hovered behind hedgerow conversations. Every village event, no matter how small, a church luncheon, a delivery at the bakery, the simple act of walking to the grocer's, became an opportunity to probe the mystery. But now, there was a name on nearly every tongue: Geoffrey Mayhew. Young, handsome in a detached way, and recently returned from a posting abroad. Geoffrey had all the makings of a figure of curiosity even before the violinist vanished. Now, with the blood smear still whispered about, and the orchard discovery still fresh, he found himself in a most unenviable spotlight. Inspector Dermot had requested an interview with the Honourable Mr. Mayhew that morning. The young man greeted the inspector in the library, where sun filtered through tall windows and the faint scent of old leather and pipe smoke lingered in the air. Geoffrey stood by the hearth, arms folded. "I assume this is about Leo Stone," he said without preamble. "That's correct," Dermot replied. "You'd met him before." "Only once," Geoffrey said. Did the tone clipped? "Briefly, on the Wednesday before the fete. He was practicing. I had no interest in classical music, so I made my excuses." Dermot raised a brow. "You didn't attend the performance during the fete?" Geoffrey's eyes flicked away. "No, I was in the village." "Where, precisely?" There was a pause, a slight tightening around the young man's jaw. "At the Green Man. I stopped in for a drink before heading for a walk. I didn't return to the fete until late in the afternoon." "Can anyone confirm that?" Geoffrey shrugged. "Possibly. I wasn't keeping track of who saw me. I didn't realize I'd need an alibi." It was the first time he allowed his irritation to show. Dermot, unfazed, jotted a note in his pocketbook. "Did you know Mr. Stone well enough to dislike him?" Geoffrey gave a tight smile. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with his disappearance?" "Just asking questions," said Dermot smoothly. "You seemed to be watching the conservatory rather closely during the fete." Geoffrey turned toward the window, his back stiff. "You'll find, Inspector, that people are very quick to assign meaning to things they don't understand. I watched the conservatory because I found the music haunting, not because I had any ill intent." "I see," said Dermot, though it was clear he wasn't satisfied. Word of the interview, as expected, leaked before the library door had even closed. Behind the inspector, By noon, 3 different versions of Geoffrey's activities had been passed around the village, each more embellished than the last. In one version, he stormed from the fete after a violent row with the violinist. In another, he had been seen slipping behind the rose hedge with a violin-shaped parcel. Neither was based on evidence, but both circulated freely at the post office and among the Thursday Bridge Club. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was doing what she did best, observing. She made a quiet visit to the Green Man, ordering a small lemonade and sitting in the corner with her knitting. She spoke to no one unless spoken to. And yet she absorbed every detail, the tone of voices, the patterns of speech, the moments when people hesitated or over-explained. She did not have to ask about Geoffrey Mayhew. The regulars at the Green Man, who were already dissecting his statement, came in just before noon, said Mr. Hatch. The innkeeper sat by the front, kept to himself, didn't talk much. "And you're sure of the time?" Miss Marple asked, as if only mildly curious. "Oh yes. I was setting the blackboard out front with the lunch specials. He walked right by, and he stayed for how long? Half hour, maybe a bit more. Then off he went. Didn't say where to." Miss Marple nodded, offering a small smile. "I see, thank you, Mr. Hatch. I always find it helpful to have clear memories. One's own can be so misleading." Back in the village proper, another suspect had begun to gather attention, albeit in whispers. Daphne, the maid. She had been the last person to see Mr. Stone before the music stopped. She had brought him his second cup of tea that day. According to her, he'd seemed calm, focused. But as the inspector quietly noted, she had also known exactly where he kept the violin, and it was Daphne who had told Mrs. Mayhew, in breathless panic, about the blood in the conservatory. Dermot visited her in the servants' quarters the same afternoon. "Miss Daphne," he began, not unkindly, "you seem to have had a closer relationship with Mr. Stone than anyone else." She flushed. "No, sir, I mean I just brought him his tea. You said he was gentle. Polite, not like other men." She looked down at her lap. "He was kind to me." "Did he ever say anything odd? Mention anyone troubling him?" "No, sir, nothing like that." "Did you see him leave the conservatory?" Her fingers twisted the hem of her apron. "No. I left him there at 1:30, when I came back at 2 to collect the tray. The door was locked." "You're certain of the times?" "Yes, sir. The kitchen clock chimes every half hour. I always wait for it. Could anyone have entered the conservatory between those times?" "I don't think so, but I wasn't watching. I had linen to collect." Later, when Miss Marple visited Daphne under the pretense of offering her a little comfort, she sat beside her with the softness of an aunt rather than a detective. She asked about Mr. Stone's habits, whether he liked sugar in his tea, whether he spoke of home. Then, casually, did he wear gloves while he played? "I noticed he didn't have any with him." Daphne looked puzzled. "No, never. He said gloves deaden the soul of a note." "Curious," said Miss Marple. "Then someone else must have had a pair, the kind that wouldn't leave fingerprints." Daphne looked up sharply. "Do you think someone did something to him?" Miss Marple patted her hand gently. "My dear, I think something very strange has happened, and strange things often bring out the worst in people, or sometimes their better selves." As the day wore on, Inspector Dermot received word from the Milchester team that they had found no further evidence of violence on the estate grounds, no new prints, no signs of the violin itself. It had vanished as completely as Leo Stone. And yet, as Miss Marple made her slow way home through the village, she felt something click into place, not a conclusion yet, but the beginning of a pattern. Someone had known precisely when to act. Someone had counted on the village looking in the wrong direction, and someone, perhaps more than one, had underestimated the value of small things, of overlooked gestures, of old women with sharp eyes and long memories. She paused at her gate, looking back toward Gossington Hall. The village had its suspects, but the truth, she suspected, was still playing just beneath the surface, like a melody waiting to be heard. The following morning, a quiet hush settled over Nether Barrow, the sort that came not from peace, but from the collective breath-holding of a community waiting for something to break. The postman made his rounds a little slower, curtains twitched. With greater frequency, the air was thick not only with the scent of dew and honeysuckle, but also with curiosity and whispered suspicion. Miss Marple, as was her routine, sat by her parlour window with her embroidery and her thoughts, her cat, Persephone, curled lazily at her feet. Outside, the lane was nearly silent. But within her mind, patterns were beginning to form, so much. Attention had been placed on the blood in the conservatory, the cufflink in the orchard, the missing violin. Each clue had screamed for notice, and yet Miss Marple had learned, through years of careful listening and quiet watching, that it was often the things that whispered which mattered more than those that shouted. She rose, setting her embroidery aside, and reached for her shawl. There was a matter she needed to look into. Something that had been bothering her since the fate was not loud enough to demand attention, but persistent, like a note just slightly out of tune. It concerned, oddly enough, a vase of flowers. At Gossington Hall during the garden fete, she had noticed a tall, etched glass vase on the conservatory table. It contained a rather bold arrangement of peonies and foxgloves too. Large, in Miss Marple's opinion, for the room, but that was not the point. The point was that later, when the body of villagers rushed to the conservatory following Mrs. Mayhew's announcement, the vase was no longer there. Miss Marple had not seen it again. An ornate glass vase does not simply vanish, so she walked to Gossington Hall once more, her cane tapping softly on the flagstones as she was greeted by the butler, a thin, slightly tremulous man named Henry who had served the Mayhews since before the war. "I wonder," Miss Marple said with a smile, "if I might have a quick word with Mrs. Mayhew. Nothing to distress her, I assure you. Merely something I forgot to ask the other day." Henry hesitated. "Madam has taken to resting in the mornings, of course," Miss Marple replied. "Then perhaps you could help me instead. I've always admired the glassware at Gossington Hall, especially the piece that was in the conservatory during the fete, a rather tall vase, quite striking." Henry blinked. "The peony vase, yes." "That one, odd," he murmured. "It's not in the usual cabinet. I assumed the housekeeper had moved it." Miss Marple offered a gentle smile. "Then perhaps it wasn't moved at all." She turned then, but not before adding, "Oh, and Henry, do you recall who arranged the flowers that day?" "Daphne did," he replied. "She was very proud of it." Miss Marple thanked him and made her way to the side garden, where the hydrangeas were in bloom. Her thoughts were not on the flowers, however. They were on the missing vase, a hidden clue, she suspected, quite literally, as she stepped behind the hedge near the east path. Her eyes scanned the overgrown edge of the orchard, and there, half covered by trailing ivy beneath a crumbling bit of garden wall, something glinted in the sun. It was the vase, shattered but not completely. Enough of the glass remained to identify it as the same etched piece. Inside its broken hollow lay something dark and dry. Miss Marple knelt, carefully lifting a piece of curved glass. The scent reached her first metallic, faint but unmistakable dried blood. Not a smear, a drip. Several, in fact. The inside of the vase held flecks of it, as though something or someone had been cleaned or hidden within it. Miss Marple stood slowly. This was not the work of someone acting in a panic. This was careful, deliberate. The conservatory had been the scene of something much more violent than a mere disappearance. She did not move the glass further, but made her way back toward the main house, where Inspector Dermot had just arrived, his coat slung over one shoulder, his brows already furrowed. "You're early," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I couldn't sleep. I thought I'd take another look at the conservatory." "Something isn't sitting right with me." "I quite agree," she said, "though I think you might want to divert your attention to the garden wall." Behind the east hedge, Dermot blinked. "Should I ask what I'll find? A broken vase, and a very inconvenient clue. By late morning, the inspector and his team have recovered the shattered glass and documented the dried blood." There was now little doubt that something more sinister had occurred in that room than anyone had yet admitted. "Why move the vase?" Dermot muttered aloud. "Why not just clean it?" Miss Marple answered softly, "Because cleaning requires time." And there were too many eyes at the fate. Moving it was quicker, and if it hadn't been for a detail-oriented maid and an old woman with an eye for hydrangeas, no one would have noticed it was gone that afternoon. The whispers in the village took on a sharper edge. There was blood. In the vase, the violinist had not simply walked away. Something terrible had happened and someone had tried to hide it. But who? Daphne was called again for questioning, pale and red-eyed. "I swear I didn't move it," she insisted. "I arranged the flowers early that morning. I never went back." Who had access to the conservatory after the music stopped? Dermot asked. Daphne hesitated. "Well, anyone could have. But I did see young Mr. Mayhew walk out from that direction, just before Mrs. Mayhew screamed." "This was new. You didn't mention that before." "I wasn't sure. It was only a glimpse. I didn't want to get it wrong." Later that evening, Miss Marple sat once again by her window. This time without her embroidery, her fingers were still. She stared out into the twilight, thinking of the music that had drifted through the fate-haunting and lonely, and of the blood hidden in a flower vase. Someone had taken great care to erase something. But what exactly had been erased? A man? A truth? Or a memory? She took up her notebook again and circled 3 names: Geoffrey Mayhew, Daphne and Cecily Mayhew. One had lied. Another had been omitted, and the third, perhaps the one who held the key, had been too quiet altogether. Miss Marple looked toward the horizon, where the sky had begun to turn from lilac to blue-black. She knew something now, something important, though still unshaped. It was not just a murder, it was a performance. And somewhere backstage, the real culprit was waiting for the final cue. The village of Nether Barrow had not known such restlessness in living memory. Conversations that once revolved around the weather, the hedgerows, and Mrs. Bantry's marmalade now lingered in doorways and market stalls, thick with theories. It wasn't just a disappearance anymore. There was blood, a broken vase, a missing violin that had yet to turn up. Though the whole countryside had been metaphorically and in some cases literally turned upside down in search of it, yet there was still nobody. Miss Marple had always said that people will tolerate the idea of theft, even of violence, but they become genuinely unsettled by absence. A corpse was definitive. Tragic though it might be, but vanishing, a man simply evaporating from a village fete in broad daylight, with no one admitting to seeing him leave. That kind of puzzle stirred up all manner of nervous energy, and nervous people, Miss Marple well knew, sometimes told more than they meant to. She found herself invited, quite innocently, to afternoon tea at the vicarage that day, a social call, or so it appeared. Reverend Chislehurst and his wife were always gracious, if occasionally burdened with the notion that Miss Marple must be lonely. It was an idea she neither corrected nor encouraged. She sipped her tea and watched Mrs. Chislehurst fluttered over a mismatched selection of biscuits while her husband absently stirred a spoon in his empty cup, clearly itching to speak. "I don't suppose you've heard the latest," he said finally, unable to hold it in. "I rarely hear anything first," Miss Marple said with a faint smile, "but I try to catch up quickly. Well, it seems Mrs. Mayhew had a private guest last week, a man who arrived late one evening and stayed overnight, not registered, not announced." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "That is unusual, especially for Cecily." Quite, said the vicar. She prides herself on her propriety. No one seemed to know about it, not even Henry, the butler. He only found out because he saw a coat left behind in the vestibule. What sort of coat? Miss Marple asked. London cut. He said, expensive, with a ticket stub in the pocket from the King's Theatre in Oxford. That would place the wearer in town just 3 nights before the fete, Miss Marple murmured. And quite possibly within reach of Mr. Leo Stone, who was said to have performed in Oxford recently. Mrs. Chislehurst leaned in, barely able to contain herself. Some say the guest came not to see Mrs. Mayhew at all, but to meet Mr. Stone privately. Do they, indeed? Yes, you see, it's believed the man was Cecily's cousin, or perhaps an old flame. There's been talk, you know, from before the war. Such talk often forgets the facts, Miss Marple said gently. But in this case, it may be worth remembering. Tell me, has anyone else mentioned this visitor? The Chislehursts glanced at each other. Well, said the vicar, Colonel Brackett saw someone leaving the back gardens that morning, early. Said he didn't look like a guest. I looked worried. A man in a fine coat walking toward the rose hedge that aligned all too neatly with the location of the broken vase and the abandoned cufflink. Miss Marple nodded to herself. Filing it away, later that afternoon, she walked the lane toward Gossington Hall again. This time, she asked specifically to see Mrs. Mayhew, Cecily Mayhew, widow of a civil servant and long-time matron of Nether Barrow Society. Had always projected a sort of studied elegance. Today, however, she looked older and pale beneath a layer of powder, with a tightly drawn mouth that had the strain of a woman attempting to maintain composure. Miss Marple, she said coolly. To what I owe the pleasure, I hope I'm not intruding, said Miss Marple, but I found myself wondering about your guest last week. The gentleman who arrived quietly. There was a pause, a brief tightening of Cecily's shoulders. I see. So the village tongues are wagging. I'm afraid they never truly stop, Miss Marple said, settling into the chair opposite her. But in this case, I think you know as well as I do that the presence of an unexpected visitor at such a delicate time may not be irrelevant. Cecily held her breath for a moment, then exhaled. It was Frederick, she said finally, my cousin. We've not spoken in years, not since, well, it hardly matters. He sent word he was passing through. I didn't wish to cause a stir. Was his visit connected to Mr. Stone? Cecily hesitated, then nodded. They knew each other once. Frederick was a patron of sorts. Supported the arts, occasionally took protégés under his wing. And something soured between them. I'm not sure of the details. Frederick only said he wished to make amends. He knew Leo would be here for the fete. Did he succeed in making those amends? I don't know. I never saw them speak. But after that morning, Frederick left quite abruptly. Miss Marple said nothing for a long moment. Cecily, she said softly, I think someone in this house knows more than they're saying. Perhaps more than one person. I believe Leo Stone was afraid of something. And I believe your cousin may have come not to reconcile but to threaten. Cecily's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup. I never meant for any of this, she whispered. I only wanted the fate to be perfect. Something beautiful to remind us all we're not forgotten. That evening, Miss Marple found herself sitting beside Colonel Brackett on a bench near the war memorial. The Colonel, always a man of principle, had little time for nonsense, but he had seen something that morning, and Miss Marple meant to hear it directly. You said you saw someone leaving the back garden, she prompted gently. Brackett grunted. Didn't look like a guest, kept his head down. Fine shoes, had the look of a man in trouble. Could it have been Geoffrey Mayhew? Could have, or anyone from London, really, but I'd bet he knew the place, moved too confidently to be a stranger. Did he carry anything? Now that you mention it, Brackett frowned. Yes, a case. A violin case, maybe. Slim and black, it looked. Heavy, that changed everything. If the case had left the estate before the discovery in the orchard, then the one they had found empty might have been a decoy. Or a duplicate, the real violin, the one Mr. Stone had been so protective of, might still be out there, or worse, already gone. Miss Marple made her way home as dusk fell. The wind rising through the branches, she was tired, yes, but her mind remained alert. Someone had gone to great lengths to create a scene, to plant clues, to stir confusion. But the truth, however well buried, had begun to show through the cracks. There had been lies about visitors, about the timing of events, about relationships long thought forgotten. Miss Marple believed the next step would not be uncovering a body, but uncovering the motive strong enough to make one disappear entirely, and she had a growing suspicion that the violin was only part of the story. It was not just a valuable instrument, it was a symbol, a memory, a threat, and someone had killed or planned to kill to silence what it represented. The next morning began with rain. Not a dramatic storm, but a slow, steady drizzle that softened the edges of Nether Barrow and turned the gravel lanes to syrupy mud. It was the sort of weather that made people linger in doorways and over tea, watching droplets trace paths down window panes while the weight of unanswered questions settled just behind the silence. By now, the name Leo Stone had become something more than a man's name. It had grown into a symbol, a cipher, a story that shifted depending on who was telling it. In some versions, he was a genius wronged by jealous rivals. In others, he was a fraud who had made one enemy to many. But no matter the version, the tale always ended in mystery, because he had not returned, and neither had his violin. Miss Marple rose early despite the gloom, dressed neatly in dove grey, and placed a small envelope in her handbag. It contained a copy of a performance programme from the King's Theatre in Oxford, sent to her by a friend in town who owed her a favour. It was dated for nights before the fete, a string quartet benefit concert featuring one Leo Stone. More interestingly, scribbled in pencil on the edge of the programme was a partial dedication to see for the past, and for what may still be forgiven. See, it could very well have been Cecily Mayhew or someone else entirely. But before Miss Marple could make her way to the hall to discuss her discovery, the village was stirred anew, not by a disappearance this time, but by something even more startling. The violin had been found. It was young Will Tavers again, the same local lad who had stumbled upon the cufflink and handkerchief. He had been fishing at the stream that curved just beyond the western edge of the Mayhew estate when his hook caught not on a stone, a branch, but on something heavy and waterlogged. He'd pulled and tugged, then screamed, for tangled in the reeds, caught beneath the overhang of the bank, was a black violin case. Water had seeped in, and the velvet lining was mottled with rot. But the instrument inside, delicate, curved, golden hued, was unmistakably the missing violin. Word travelled faster than the constable. Within the hour, half the village had gathered on the bank, umbrellas aloft, watching as Inspector Dermot carefully lifted the sodden case onto a tarpaulin. He kept the villagers at bay with one hand while the other traced the water-warped surface of the case. Miss Marple arrived just as the violin was being removed. "It's him," Daphne whispered, having appeared without sound beside her. "It's Leo's, I'd know it anywhere." "Indeed," said Miss Marple quietly, "and yet it's very odd, don't you think, that it should be here rather than in the orchard, where the empty case was found?" Daphne didn't answer. She was watching the violin as if it might speak. Dermot turned to Miss Marple with a grim expression. "Someone went to great lengths to mislead us. I believe the empty case we found in the orchard was a plant to make us think the violin had been taken far from the hall, which only raises the question," Miss Marple said, "of why they would discard the real one in such a vulnerable place. The stream is hardly secure. It could have washed away, or been found days earlier. Perhaps they panicked," Dermot muttered. Miss Marple shook her head. No, I think it was meant to be found, just not too soon. The longer it remained hidden, the more muddled the timeline became, the more people could forget what they saw or think they saw. Inspector Dermot frowned, clearly turning something over in his mind. Also, Miss Marple added, it was only Will who found both the cufflink and the violin. Now, I don't doubt the boy's honesty, but one does wonder whether someone meant for him to find those things. That's a disturbing thought, Dermot said. A breadcrumb trail laid out for a child. Not disturbing, Miss Marple said gently, merely careful, a mind that understands distraction and the use of innocence. Later that day, the violin was taken to Milchester for examination, and the house at Gossington Hall was subjected to another round of scrutiny. Daphne was questioned again. Though nothing new was gleaned, Geoffrey Mayhew remained elusive, claiming a sudden need to return to London, though Dermot wisely prevented him from leaving until the investigation concluded. It was then that Miss Marple decided to pay a visit not to the hall, but to the village library. Mrs. Ellison, who ran it with the precision of a military campaign, welcomed her with tea and a modest smile. I'm afraid we don't have much in the way of music history, she said apologetically. That's quite all right, Miss Marple replied. I'm actually looking for old newspapers. Anything from 5 to 7 years ago. Reviews, perhaps. For what? Subject, performances in London, specifically involving Leo Stone. It took some time, but the reward came near the bottom of a dusty stack, a short article in the Evening Gazette. Dated 6 years ago, headline scandal at Society recital accusation of plagiarism against young violinist. The piece detailed an abrupt and very public accusation made by a prominent music benefactor against Leo Stone. The charge was that Stone had stolen a composition, a private piece shared in confidence. The benefactor remained unnamed in the article, but it mentioned a private club in Mayfair and a cancelled engagement that cost Stone dearly. Miss Marple folded the clipping neatly into her handbag, back in her sitting room that evening. The pieces began to fit more firmly. The benefactor Frederick must have accused Stone of theft, perhaps rightly, perhaps not. Cecily, once caught between the two, had buried the incident, hoping it would vanish with time. But it hadn't. It had returned with music played in the conservatory that sounded eerily familiar, not because it was Stone's latest work, but because it may not have been his at all. Motive, then, not simply revenge, but the preservation of reputation. And somewhere in the centre of it all the real truth, hiding not in the violin's disappearance, but in its reappearance. Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, then lifted her pen and made one final note in her book, a second chance, disguised as redemption, is still only a mask. Outside, the rain continued, but Miss Marple knew the storm had only just begun. Someone in the village still believed they had gotten away with murder. But the return of the violin had changed the tune, and Miss Marple was ready to listen very, very carefully to the next note. The next day broke with a deceptive quietness. The rain had stopped, leaving behind dew-drenched hedges and soft patches of earth that clung to boots and revealed more than one set of footprints along the eastern paths of Nether Barrow. The stream babbled innocently, betraying no hint that it had recently held the most sought-after object in the village, Leo Stone's priceless violin. Miss Marple, unbothered by the wet ground, stepped outside her cottage just after 9 o'clock, gloved hands holding a small notebook and her handbag. The air was fresh and cool, and the sky, though still grey, carried the promise of eventual light. She had made up her mind. There was one person left to observe, not from a distance, not through second-hand reports or overheard conversations. It was time for a more deliberate encounter, a test, as it were, not an accusation. Miss Marple did not believe in blunt confrontation, but people she had learned always betrayed themselves when faced with a question that was just a little too precise, especially if they believed they were still in control of the narrative. Her destination was the hall. She had sent a note earlier that morning, requesting tea with Geoffrey Mayhew. It was framed as a neighbourly concern, a kind inquiry from an old friend of his mother's, and Geoffrey, perhaps out of politeness or curiosity, had agreed. She was shown into the drawing-room, where logs had been laid in the hearth but not lit. The chill suited the mood. Geoffrey entered a few minutes later, dressed impeccably, as always, crisp collar, polished shoes, but a tension behind his eyes that had grown noticeably sharper in recent days. "Miss Marple," he said with a forced smile, "I must admit I didn't expect you to request a visit." "I imagine not," she said, her tone warm, "but I find there's very little use in waiting these days. One never knows when the opportunity for conversation might vanish altogether." He poured the tea with a steady hand, but she noticed the way he stirred his own with a little more force than necessary. They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes, the weather, the state of the gardens, the lingering effects of the fete, until Miss Marple shifted the tone with a single sentence. "It must have been rather painful," she said gently, "to see Mr. Stone again after all that happened in Oxford." There was a pause, not long, barely noticeable, but Geoffrey's breath caught for half a second. "I wasn't aware you knew anything had happened in Oxford," he said, setting down his cup with deliberate care. "Oh, I make it a point to know a little something about everything," she replied. "It's rather a habit now, especially when people vanish and priceless instruments go for a swim." He gave a short laugh. "You think I had something to do with that?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that someone here wanted Leo Stone silenced, and I think that silence wasn't about the violin at all, but about what it represented." He stood abruptly. "You've been listening to rumours." "I've been listening to people," she said calmly, "which is usually where the truth hides, and I found it curious, very curious indeed, that you, of all people, have had so very little to say about a man you clearly disliked." Geoffrey turned toward the window, his hands clenched behind his back. "He destroyed someone I cared about," he said finally. "Frederick didn't just support Leo, he believed in him, introduced him to patrons, loaned him money, even gave him access to private compositions, and Leo repaid him by stealing one, then performing it as his own. That would be a deep betrayal." Miss Marple said softly, "It was. Frederick was ruined." "Quietly, yes, but thoroughly. He left the circles he once ruled. Cecily pretended it hadn't happened, but I never forgot." "So you came back to Nether Barrow not for your mother," Miss Marple said, "but for revenge." He turned to her, his face pale. "No, I came to confront him, just to speak with him, to let him know that we hadn't forgotten what he'd done, but he was smug, insufferable." He laughed, said no one could prove anything now. Miss Marple watched him quietly. "And when did this conversation happen?" "The night before the fete. I found him in the conservatory, rehearsing. I didn't threaten him, if that's what you think, but I made it clear he wasn't welcome. You were seen, you know," she said, "that morning, just before the commotion began. Colonel Brackett mentioned a man walking from the conservatory toward the rose hedge, carrying something." Geoffrey's expression shifted. "I was returning a case, a mistake. I'd taken the wrong one the night before. I realized and brought it back. The case we found in the orchard." He didn't answer. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You're a clever man, Geoffrey, but clever men often make mistakes when they believe everyone else is simple. Tell me, did you know the real violin had already been hidden in the stream?" His silence was all the answer she needed. She stood, smoothing her skirt. "I won't trouble you further, but I do believe Inspector Dermot may wish to speak with you again. You see, while there's still nobody, there is no intent, and in the eyes of the law, that matters very much." She paused at the door. "You didn't kill him, did you?" He looked at her, defiance melting into something closer to shame. I wanted to, he said, but no. I left him alive, I swear it. Then someone else finished what you started, she said, and they did it very, very quietly. That evening, Miss Marple met Inspector Dermot on the footpath just before sunset. He confessed to the confrontation, she told him, and to staging the empty case he thought it would cast doubt on the timeline. But he insists he didn't harm Leo. Dermot sighed. It's plausible, but it means someone else used the confusion to act, and perhaps, said Miss Marple, not even in a moment of rage. Perhaps it was cold, planned, someone who understood that. Leo's music might reveal more than he'd intended. Reveal what? Dermot asked. Miss Marple looked out over the fields, the last of the sun touching the grass with gold. Truth, Inspector, truth disguised as melody. That's the most dangerous kind. As the wind picked up, Miss Marple turned for home, her step steady. She had planted her seeds. Now she would wait and watch for the one who couldn't help but return to the scene of the lie, because guilt, like music, had a way of repeating itself, and the final note had not yet been played. It was just after twilight when the call came from Gossington Hall. Miss Marple, seated in her parlour with a warm shawl across her shoulders, was sipping the last of her chamomile tea when Henry, the Mayhew's butler, appeared at her gate. His hat in hand and a strange stiffness in his stance, his breath came in little puffs, white in the cooling evening air. Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, he said, his voice low and strained. Madam would very much like a word with you. She seems troubled. Miss Marple nodded gently and rose without fuss, her shawl folded over one arm, her expression unreadable. She accompanied him through the lanes and up toward the looming silhouette of Gossington Hall. The gas lamps had been lit, casting flickering light against the tall hedges and ivy-covered stone. Inside, the house was hushed. Cecily Mayhew was alone in the drawing-room, seated with rigid posture near the unlit fireplace. A single lamp on the side table cast her face in uneven light, making her appear both fragile and fierce, a porcelain figurine poised on the verge of breaking. You came, she said without turning. I wasn't certain you would. I always come when the truth is ready, said Miss Marple softly, taking the armchair opposite. There was silence for a moment, broken only by the quiet tick of the clock on the mantel. I should never have invited him, Cecily said at last, but I didn't think it would come to this. I thought they would talk, settle things like gentlemen. You're speaking of Frederick. Yes, he arrived quietly. I told no one, not even Geoffrey. He came not to seek forgiveness, but to issue a warning. He said Leo was going to perform a piece that wasn't his, one of Frederick's own. Shared in confidence years ago, and I believed him, because you had heard it before, Miss Marple said gently. Cecily nodded. Once, at a private salon, long before the war. It haunted me for weeks, and when Leo played in the conservatory it was the same. Not a note out of place. Miss Marple leaned forward. Slightly. Frederick threatened him. Yes, he demanded Leo withdraw from the performance, said if he didn't, he would expose him. But Leo refused. He said there was no proof, and besides, he believed no one cared about ownership anymore, just sound. But someone did care, said Miss Marple. Cecily's eyes flickered. He left that night. Frederick, I thought the matter was done, but the next day, something changed. Leo didn't come out for lunch. Daphne found the door locked, then the blood of the missing violin. Miss Marple watched her closely. It wasn't Frederick, was it? Cecily didn't answer, but the silence confirmed it. Miss Marple took a quiet breath. You knew, and you covered it. Yes, Cecily whispered, not at first, but later. When I realized who had done it, Miss Marple's voice remained calm, almost tender. It was Daphne. The name hovered in the room like smoke. Cecily's shoulders dropped, and she folded her hands in her lap. She heard them arguing. The night before, she adored Leo and fancied herself in love. I think he never encouraged her. Not deliberately, but she was young, impressionable, when she overheard what Frederick said, that Leo had stolen music, betrayed someone. It broke something in her. She confronted him. Miss Marple said, "Yes, in the conservatory, the morning of the fete. Just after I left to greet guests. I believe she begged him to deny it, to tell her Frederick was lying. But he didn't. He was arrogant, careless, said it didn't matter, that the past was past." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And she struck him, perhaps without realizing what it would do with the vase," Cecily said. "She always arranged the flowers herself. She knew it was heavy, knew it would hurt, and then she panicked, cleaned what she could, dragged his body out through the back conservatory door and into the woodshed behind the orchard. That's where she left him." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. "She planted the cufflink, left the handkerchief, and Geoffrey, for all his faults, created the decoy case to cast out elsewhere." Cecily nodded. They each believed they were acting alone, but in truth, they were compounding the same crime. A murder driven not by greed or hatred but by disappointment. "And the violin?" Miss Marple asked. Cecily closed her eyes. She found it beside him. She couldn't bear to destroy it. So she took it to the stream, hide it, thinking that would sever the last tie. Miss Marple rose slowly and crossed the room to the window. Beyond the glass, the grounds of Gossington Hall lay quiet, cloaked in mist. The orchard trees, black against the moonlight, stood like witnesses. "She will have to confess," Miss Marple said. "The inspector must be told." "I know," said Cecily. "She's waiting in her room. She said she would speak, if you asked her to." Miss Marple turned back to her. "You protected her, as though she were your own." Cecily's lips trembled. "She is the closest thing I've had to a daughter." Miss Marple nodded once. Then she crossed the room and touched the woman's shoulder. "The law will do what it must. But I will ask Inspector Dermot to be kind. The world has not been kind enough to any of you." As she stepped into the hallway, Henry the butler waited with his usual quiet dignity. Miss Marple handed him a small envelope. "A note for Inspector Dermot," she said. "He'll know what to do." And then she climbed the stairs slowly, toward the room where Daphne waited, outside. The wind had begun to rise, and with it the leaves danced along the paths of Nether Barrow. The music had stopped, but the truth at last had been played. The next morning dawned bright and brittle, the kind of morning that feels almost too clean, as though the night before had been scrubbed away and something new laid over the village like fresh linen. In Nether Barrow, where the cottagers stood shoulder to shoulder like old friends, and ivy curled over red brick with studied charm, the village stirred with a peculiar silence, not the hush of uncertainty, but the quiet that comes after truth has been spoken aloud. Miss Marple rose at her usual time, made her tea, and sat by the window, watching the light creep through the hedgerows. It was Saturday, and the bell from the church tower struck 8. Across the lane, Mrs. Hargraves was hanging laundry with a little more care than usual, down by the bakery. The scent of fresh bread drifted up the street. Life, as it always did, had begun to resume its well-worn rhythm, but there was a difference now. Something had shifted beneath the surface. The news, as these things tend to do, spread quickly. Daphne had confessed. Quietly, solemnly, without dramatics. In the small room above the kitchen at Gossington Hall, with Miss Marple and Inspector Dermot seated on either side, she had spoken in halting words of the morning in the conservatory. Her eyes had been dry, but her voice carried all the weight of regret. "I didn't mean to hurt him," she had said, "only to stop him. He laughed and said I was nothing. that no one would ever believe me, I picked up the vase without thinking. And that had been that. There was no need for force, no great chase, only the quiet acknowledgement that something irreversible had been done, and that now the village must go on living with it. Inspector Dermot, true to his word, was fair. He arrested Daphne with courtesy, allowed her to change her clothes, and ensured that her departure from the hall was private, witnessed only by a few staff and Miss Marple herself. Cecily Mayhew stood by the stairwell as the girl descended. She said nothing, but her face was pale and her hands trembled when Daphne paused at the foot of the stairs. Cecily stepped forward and embraced her. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. For all of it, the scene stayed with Miss Marple long after the police car rolled out of the village. Later that day, Geoffrey Mayhew, in an uncharacteristic act of humility, approached Miss Marple near the war memorial. His eyes were shadowed, and he had the look of a man who had been standing too long in the rain. "I suppose you think poorly of me," he said without preamble. Miss Marple folded her hands in front of her. "I think, Mr. Mayhew, that people do foolish things when they believe they've been wronged, and they do unkind things when they think no one is watching. But you did not strike the blow." "No," he said, looking away, "but I allowed the lie to flourish. I should have come forward the moment the blood was found. Instead, I thought I could outwit the situation." "You're not the first man to believe strategy would hide conscience," she replied gently, "but you might still do something good with what's left." He nodded. "I'll stay. Help Mother, she's not strong anymore, Miss." Marple offered a small, approving smile. That would be a start. The inquest, when it was held, was quiet and swift. A verdict of manslaughter was reached, with Daphne's confession accepted in full. Her youth, her clean record, and her evident remorse all weighed in her favour. She would serve time. Yes, but not forever. The judge had looked at her with a kind of sorrow not often found in the courtroom. Back in Nether Barrow, conversation turned gradually back to more mundane things: the state of the vicar's roses, the price of eggs, a fox that had been seen near the coop behind the bakery. Yet, every now and again, the name Leo Stone would surface, whispered, not shouted, like a ghost whose song had not quite faded from the air. Miss Marple, when asked about the case, demurred politely. "Oh, I simply listened," she would say. "You'd be surprised what people will tell you when they think you're not really there." But behind that modest smile lay the full weight of what had unfolded. It had not been just about a murder, not even about a violin. It had been about pride, about the damage done when ambition turns careless, when love goes unspoken until it curdles into obsession. It had been about those small acts of silence, the things not said that allow wrongs to blossom in shadow. A few days after the funeral, a modest affair was held at a chapel on the edge of the neighbouring town, attended only by a scattering of musicians and one former patron who refused to speak. Miss Marple received a package at her door. No note accompanied it, just brown paper, a tied string, and a faint scent of varnish. Inside was the violin, not Leo Stone's original, but a replica, delicate, hand-finished, and beautifully preserved. On the underside of the chin rest, engraved so lightly it could be missed, was a single line to the one who listens. Miss Marple held it for a long time, the weight of it resting gently in her lap. She didn't need to know who had sent it. She understood. It wasn't an offering. It was a recognition that sometimes music reveals the truth no one is willing to speak aloud, and sometimes someone has to hear it anyway. She stood, placed the instrument on the shelf above the fireplace, and returned to her garden, where the peonies were beginning to bloom again. The sun was high now, breaking through clouds with a soft, determined glow. From the church steeple, the bells began to chime. Nether Barrow breathed once more, unchanged and yet never quite the same. And Miss Marple, seated beneath the yew tree in her front garden, watched it all with quiet satisfaction. Her knitting needles clicked gently, her tea cooled beside her. She had no need for thanks. After all, people rarely thank the mirror for telling the truth. They simply adjust what they see and get on with the day.